Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
The auction hall on Meridian Station smelled, as it always did, like recycled ambition and hydraulic fluid, which Eli Voss had come to understand as the natural perfume of opportunity in its least glamorous form. He stood near the back of the hall with his scanner hanging from his belt and a protein packet in his hand that had been room temperature for so long it had transcended the concept of temperature entirely and arrived at something more philosophical. He ate it anyway. He had learned over 11 years in the salvage trade that the relationship between a man and his lunch was not always one of mutual enthusiasm, and that this was fine. The hall itself was a vast, vaulted space in the station's lower commercial ring, with ceilings high enough that the upper gantries were permanently lost in the kind of industrial haze that accumulates wherever machines have been running longer than anyone has been cleaning. Holographic lot displays rotated slowly above each numbered station, projecting specifications in the Common Trade Interface Standard, which was to say in a typeface designed by a committee of 17 species who had disagreed about the nature of legible text and compromised by making it equally difficult for everyone. Eli had been reading CTI specs for a decade and still had to occasionally stop and consider whether a particular symbol indicated fuel capacity or a warranty disclaimer. Usually, it was the warranty disclaimer. Usually it said there wasn't one. He had come to Meridian's decommission auction with a budget of 12,000 credits, a list of 3 target lots, and the kind of carefully calibrated pessimism that he had learned to call professionalism. His own ship, the Vardy's Belle, was docked in berth 41 with a list of repairs that had been accumulating long enough to qualify as a historical document, the most pressing of which was the atmospheric scrubber on the lower deck, which had been producing breathable air for several months now, but producing it with a faint and persistent smell that he had eventually identified as coming from the scrubber's biological filter medium, which had developed a microbial imbalance that no amount of cleaning compound had managed to correct. The air on the Vardy's Belle was safe. It was oxygenated, properly pressurized, and entirely breathable. It just smelled, softly and continuously, like the inside of someone else's boot. He had stopped noticing it at home. He noticed it every time he came back from anywhere else. The auctioneer was a tall Cerethian with the kind of professional vocal projection that suggested formal training and the kind of expression that suggested he had sold enough decommissioned ships to know that enthusiasm was counterproductive. Cerethians had 3 sets of vocal cords and used all of them simultaneously when speaking standard trade, which produced a layered quality to the voice that humans often described as harmonic, and that Eli found, if he was being honest, slightly unsettling in the way of a sound that his ears processed as 2 things at once. He'd worked with a Cerethian parts broker for 2 years and had eventually acclimatized. It had taken 8 months. The broker had found this entirely unremarkable. Lots 1 through 6 moved through the hall at the brisk, unsentimental pace of things no one wanted very much. A drive housing in certified poor condition went to a woman with a tablet computer who didn't look up during the bidding. A navigation array from a model so old that Eli's scanner couldn't fully read its configuration went to no one, and was passed without ceremony. A lot of miscellaneous internal fittings was sold to a consortium bid, from a name he didn't recognize for a price that suggested they knew something he didn't. And he made a note to look into that later and then didn't write the note anywhere, which meant he would forget it, which had happened many times before with many notes, and which he had at some point accepted as an aspect of his character rather than a correctable flaw. Lot 7 appeared on the holographic display above Station 7 as a schematic of a mid-range transport vessel, designation Orrery Pale, with a registration number that predated Eli's career in the trade. The schematic rotated slowly, showing a vessel that had the proportions of something designed for utility rather than grace. A wide cargo section amidships, crew quarters in the stern drive assembly that had been a workhorse model when it was new and was now simply old. The specifications loaded in CTI standard, and he read them with the particular focused attention he reserved for the critical columns. Hull integrity, which was certified pressure intact, independently verified, the one thing in this lot description that was unambiguous. Internal systems, which were listed as unverified, which was the auction's way of saying unknown, which was the seller's way of saying they had not looked and did not want to look and were very much hoping someone else would buy the looking along with the hull. And then, in the liability and contents disclosure section, the phrase that appeared in some form in every as-is auction listing he had ever read. Buyer accepts full responsibility for interior contents and any associated remediation or legal obligations arising therefrom. He had read that clause on enough listings to know that it covered a spectrum from the inconvenient to the genuinely alarming, and that the specific combination of unverified systems, as is condition, and the conspicuously thorough liability language in this particular listing suggested something in the upper portion of that spectrum. He looked around the hall. The orrery pail had generated a small cluster of interest, 4 other bidders with scanners out, running the same calculations he was running, and he watched them the way he always watched competing bidders, which was with the specific attention of someone trying to determine whether they knew something he didn't. The woman 3 stations down had already put her scanner away. The 2 men in matching jackets from what appeared to be a mid-tier chop operation were talking to each other in low voices. A 4th bidder, someone he didn't recognize, was staring at the holographic schematic with the expression of a person doing arithmetic in their head and arriving at an answer they didn't like. The bidding opened at 7,000. Eli raised his card. So did the 2 men in matching jackets. So did the unrecognized 4th bidder, who dropped out at 9,000 with the air of someone who had been waiting for a number that would confirm a prior decision. The matching jackets went to 10, then dropped out of the bidding together, both cards going down at the same moment, as if they had rehearsed it, or as if one of them had said something to the other that functioned as a shared conclusion. Eli watched them put their cards away and wondered what they had concluded, and whether it was the kind of conclusion he should also be reaching. He raised his card to 11,000. No one else raised. The auctioneer's layered voice confirmed the sale with a note that Eli had learned to identify, after years of practice, as professional neutrality masking mild surprise, and Eli Voss became the owner of the orrery pail for 11,000 credits, and the full scope of whatever buyer accepts full responsibility for interior contents meant in practice. He finished the protein packet. It did not taste like anything he could name. He added the orrery pail to the asset column of the spreadsheet on his wrist display, noted the purchase price, and began the short walk to the station's lower storage bay, where his new ship was waiting in berth 63. He had not named a budget for remediation costs. He had not named one because naming one required knowing what he might be remediating, and the honest answer to that question was that he had no idea. And writing unknown in a budget column was something he reserved for situations he could not avoid and had learned, through the kind of accumulated professional experience that looks from the inside like character development and from the outside like a series of expensive lessons, to treat as a starting point rather than a warning. The storage bay was colder than the auction hall, and larger, and the orrery pail sat in berth 63 looking exactly like its schematic had suggested it would. Utilitarian, aged, and entirely without charm. Its hull was the dull gray of a vessel that had not been polished in so long that the original color was a matter of speculation. The docking seals were intact. The external running lights were off. The whole thing had the particular stillness of something that had been sitting in one place for long enough that the station had begun to forget it was there. He stood outside it for a moment, scanner in hand, running the initial pass that he always ran before boarding a new acquisition, checking atmosphere seal, checking for active radiation sources, checking the power status readout that would tell him whether anything inside was drawing current from somewhere. The hull scan came back clean. The radiation check returned nominal. The power status was what he had expected from a decommissioned vessel with no active systems, a flat line of zero draw across every circuit. He looked at that readout. He looked at the ship. He pulled up his boarding checklist, which he had written himself several years ago and which began, in a note he had added after a particular incident in year 3, with the line, "Before opening any door, confirm you want to know what's behind it." He wanted to know what was behind it. He almost always did. It was possibly his defining professional flaw, and it was definitely the reason he was still in this business after 11 years of evidence suggesting he should have found something safer. He applied his access credentials to the docking seal, listened to the equalization cycle run its brief negotiation with the station atmosphere, and stepped aboard the orrery pail for the first time, into air that was stale and cold and smelled of nothing, which after months on the Vardy's bell he registered, absurdly, as a relief. The interior of the orrery pail had the specific quality of a place that had been abandoned gradually rather than all at once. The way a house goes quiet not when the last person leaves but sometime earlier, when the last person stops caring. The corridor lights had defaulted to their emergency minimum, a dim amber that turned every surface the color of old brass and made the shadows between conduit brackets look deeper than they were. Eli moved through it slowly, scanner running, the soft chime of each reading the only sound besides his own footsteps on grating that resonated slightly differently in each section, a map of what lay underneath expressed in tone rather than text. He worked methodically, the way he always did on a first walkthrough. Bow to stern, port to starboard, every compartment opened and assessed and logged before moving to the next. The bridge first, which was stripped to its functional minimum, navigational console, 2 operator stations, a communications array whose displays had burned out in a pattern that he paused to look at for a moment because it genuinely resembled, in the amber emergency light, a series of low hills at dusk, which was the kind of thing a man noticed after too many hours alone on ships that didn't talk back. The drive monitoring station in the next compartment was intact but dead, its indicators dark, everything in the correct resting state for a vessel with no power draw. The cargo section amidships was empty, or nearly. There was a crate secured to the aft wall that his scanner identified as containing a quantity of desiccant packing material and nothing else, which meant someone had shipped something carefully enough to pack it properly, and then left the packaging behind, which told a small story he couldn't quite read. The galley was where the ship began to show its age most honestly. The food processor had something calcified in its intake cavity that his scanner classified as organic residue of indeterminate composition, and that he classified, looking at it, as a problem for someone who cared more than he did. The table was bolted to the floor at an angle that was close enough to level to suggest it had been intentional and wrong enough to suggest otherwise. One of the chairs was missing entirely, the 4 bolt holes in the floor where it had been standing in a neat square like a small, tidy absence. He noted the galley as salvageable minus the processor, pushed the intake door shut with one finger, and moved on. The crew quarters occupied the stern section, 4 cabins arranged in 2 pairs along a corridor that was narrower than the forward passages, the kind of design decision that made sense on paper and made people turn sideways in practice. The first 2 cabins opened without resistance, basic quarters, stripped of personal effects, the sleeping surfaces bare and the storage units empty, except for a set of standard-issue evacuation instructions in 4 languages, mounted to the inside of the first cabin's door in the way that regulations required, and that no one ever actually read. The third cabin had a stuck door that yielded to a firm push and revealed a space that was identical to the first 2, except for a coating of fine particulate on every horizontal surface, which his scanner identified as mineral dust consistent with a ventilation filter that had failed slowly over a long period, distributing itself democratically throughout the compartment until every surface held an equal, thin layer of the ship's own slow deterioration. It was the fourth cabin that stopped him. The door at the end of the corridor was sealed in a way that looked different from everything else he had encountered in the ship, and the difference was not in its appearance, but in something his eye caught after a moment of looking. The access panel beside it had an indicator light, small and green and blinking with the slow, steady patience of a system that had been doing exactly this for a very long time and intended to continue. Everything else on the orrery pale was dark. This light was on. He stood in front of it for a moment with his scanner raised, the way a person holds a flashlight towards something they are not entirely certain they want to illuminate, and the scanner confirmed what his eye had caught. The panel was drawing power. Not much, a trickle, the kind of consumption that would barely register on a station's metering system, but active, continuous, coming from a source the scanner could detect but not locate, somewhere behind the door. He tried his salvage credentials first, entering the code sequence into the panel's interface with the professional confidence of a man who has opened a few hundred locked doors on decommissioned vessels and considers this a routine matter. The panel processed his credentials with a brief, businesslike series of tones, and then returned an error message in a script he did not recognize. Not an unfamiliar language. He had a mid-grade translation suite on his scanner, rated for 43 written systems, and it had never simply refused to identify a script before. It identified this one as unknown, which was a word that appeared in his scanner's output rarely enough that it took him a moment to parse what it meant in context. He looked at it. He looked at the panel. He entered his credentials again. The panel played a different sequence of tones. Then, after a pause that felt oddly considered, it produced a single sound, brief and rising in pitch, that his translation suite rendered as, and he read this twice, a probable interrogative marker in an unclassified phonemic system. The door had asked him something, he did not know what. He stood in the amber-lit corridor of a ship he had owned for approximately 2 hours and thought about the fact that a door had just asked him a question, and that he did not have the vocabulary to answer it, and that this was genuinely new territory even by his professional standards, which had included a ship with a live fauna infestation, a vessel whose previous owner had repurposed the water reclamation system for chemistry that was unambiguously illegal in 6 jurisdictions, and one memorable afternoon involving a cargo container that had turned out to contain a fully functional automated defense system that someone had forgotten to deactivate before decommissioning. The door was new. He tried the station's emergency override codes, which were issued to licensed salvage operators for exactly this category of situation, and which carried the legal weight of Meridian Station's authority behind them. The panel accepted them with what seemed like genuine consideration, a longer processing interval than his own credentials had received, and then rejected them with a third error message in the same unknown script, longer this time, which his scanner rendered as unclassified extended notation, possible conditional statement, confidence level low. He was being turned down at length. He was receiving from a door a detailed explanation of why he was not getting in, and he lacked the linguistic framework to understand any of it. He went back to the galley, sat down at the tilted table, and ate the second protein packet from his jacket pocket while he thought about this. The packet was a different flavor from the first one, nominally. In practice, it was the same experience with slightly different coloring. He ate it and pulled up his scanner's access log, reviewing the panel's responses with the methodical patience of someone who has learned that looking at a problem from a sitting position sometimes produces results that looking at it while standing does not. The power draw was consistent. Whatever was behind the door had been running on its own supply for long enough that the supply was clearly substantial. The unknown script on the panel was the same in all 3 responses, same character set, different content, which meant it was a real language and not a malfunction generating symbols at random, which was the thing he had been quietly hoping it might be. He found the maintenance access diagram for the Orrery Pales crew quarters section in the ship's documentation archive, which was one of the few systems still partially accessible through the bridge terminal, and located the manual override mechanism for the stern cabin locks, a physical failsafe behind a panel 2 meters back from the fourth door. Standard in this vessel class because the engineers who designed it had a professional distrust of electronic systems that Eli was currently feeling a great deal of sympathy for. He found the panel. He found that 2 of its 4 fasteners had been stripped at some point and replaced with a repair solution involving a compound adhesive that had, over the intervening years, set to approximately the consistency of structural ceramic. He did not have the correct tool for this in the kit on his belt. He went back to the cargo section, found the maintenance locker set into the aft bulkhead, and spent 7 minutes determining that the locker contained a nearly complete set of the correct tools, a near-complete set being different from a complete set in ways that required improvisation, and that the improvisation required was achievable with what he had if he was patient and did not care about the finish on the panel cover. He was patient. He did not care about the finish on the panel cover. 23 minutes after sitting down at the galley table, he had the manual override engaged, and the fourth cabin's door ran its release cycle with the sound of a mechanism that had not moved in a very long time, and found the experience stiff and reluctant. A long mechanical exhale followed by the soft click of a lock disengaging, and then the door swung inward on its hinge, and the air that came out of the cabin to meet him was warmer than the corridor by several degrees, not dramatically. Not the warmth of a fire, but the warmth of a room where something had been running continuously for a long time, and his scanner was already reading the interior before his eyes fully adjusted to what was in it. There was a pod. It occupied most of the cabin's floor space, roughly 2 meters long, of a design his scanner looked at for a full 4 seconds before producing any output at all, which was the scanner's equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. The pod's casing was a material his scanner classified as composite unknown, its surface the color of deep graphite with a texture that seemed to absorb the amber emergency light rather than reflect it, and at its head end, a viewport panel, frosted with the condensation of a temperature differential that had been maintained without interruption for however long the pod had been running. He could see through the frost a silhouette, the unmistakable geometry of a person lying still, hands folded, the outline of a face. His scanner said, occupied, active biological readings, suspended metabolic function consistent with stasis protocols, power source, independent, unclassified, estimated remaining capacity, and here the scanner paused again in its processing way before completing the sentence, sufficient for continued operation, current consumption rate, estimated 60 to 100 hours remaining. He looked at the number. He looked at the pod. He looked at the frosted viewport, and then, because the cabin temperature was fractionally higher near the glass, and because physics does not negotiate, he watched the frost begin, very slowly, to clear at the center of the viewport, and the details of the face on the other side resolved themselves into his vision one piece at a time, the way a certainty arrives. Not all at once, but in increments, each one slightly past the point of comfortable doubt. He stood there for a long time. His scanner was logging everything and producing readings he would need several hours and possibly a specialist to interpret. Outside, on the station, the auction hall was already cycling to its next lot. Someone was buying a drive housing in certified poor condition. Somewhere, the Vardy's Bell was sitting in berth 41, filling itself with air that smelled faintly of someone else's boot. He had purchased a ship that had come with a passenger no one had mentioned. He had the specific feeling of a man who has reached into what he believed was an empty box and found it was not empty, and who is still processing, in real time, what exactly he has found. The first thing Eli did was go back to the galley, because the galley was the place on any ship where a person went when they needed to think, and because thinking, in his experience, was best done at a table, even a tilted one, even on a ship he had owned for less than a morning, and that had just revealed itself to contain a stasis pod, with an occupant that his scanner could not classify, and that he could not stop looking at through a clearing viewport, and so had deliberately walked away from before he was done looking, which was not something he did often and which told him, with the particular honesty of unusual behavior, that he was more unsettled than he was prepared to admit out loud. He opened his wrist display and started a list. He always started a list. It was not a sophisticated coping mechanism, but it was his, and it had the practical advantage of converting a large, shapeless problem into a series of smaller, shaped ones that could be addressed sequentially, even when the addressing of any one of them would immediately generate 3 new items. The list began. 1. Assess situation, which he crossed off immediately because he had assessed it, and the assessment was that the situation was extraordinary, and crossing something off at the start gave him a momentum he was aware was artificial and relied on anyway. 2. Determine legal status of discovery. 3. Contact station authority. 4. Research vessel history. 5. Determine identity of occupant. 6. Determine power cell status and remaining window. He looked at item 6 for a moment and moved it to item 2, then renumbered everything, which took longer than it should have, and meant he was now staring at a tidy, numbered list on his wrist display that was organized correctly, and that he had absolutely no idea how to begin. He contacted Gerald instead. Gerald was the Vardes Bell's shipboard AI, which Eli had acquired second-hand along with the ship itself 8 years ago, and which had been running continuously since a manufacturing date that Gerald had once cited with the offhand tone of someone mentioning a birthday, and that Eli had looked up afterward with a feeling that he could only describe as concern. Gerald communicated by text because the voice interface had developed a fault 14 months ago that no technician Eli had consulted could fully explain, and no repair Eli could afford had fully corrected. And the result was that Gerald's voice output now produced speech, with the specific tonal quality of someone who had just finished a very large and somewhat regrettable meal. A resonance that Eli had endured for 2 months before switching Gerald to text only, by mutual, unspoken agreement. Gerald had never commented on this. Gerald communicated via short, syntactically minimal messages that Eli had come to read the way other people read tone of voice, and which were, in their compression, more expressive than Gerald probably intended. He sent Gerald the scanner data from the 4th cabin. He waited. 60 seconds later, his wrist display produced Gerald's response, which read, "This is unusual." Eli wrote back, "Yes, Gerald. The pod is not in any database I have access to." Eli, "I know, Gerald, I looked anyway, 3 times, I want that noted." Eli noted, "Gerald, who is she?" Eli, "That is item 5 on my list." Gerald, "Where is she on your list?" Eli, "She was 6, I moved her to 5. Gerald, "I would have made her 1. Eli put his wrist display down on the tilted table where it sat at a slight angle that matched the table's geometry and looked at the galley wall for a moment. He was not a man who was easily rattled. He had been in the salvage trade for 11 years and had opened enough sealed compartments on enough decommissioned vessels to have developed a professional relationship with the unexpected, which was to say that the unexpected did not surprise him as a category, only in its specific contents. But this specific content was operating in a register he had not previously encountered, and he was honest enough with himself, in the privacy of his own galley thinking, to acknowledge that the problem was not purely logistical. The problem was also that he had stood in front of that viewport for longer than the scanner data required, watching the frost clear, and that the face that had come into resolution through the glass had done something to his attention that he could not attribute to professional assessment, and that he was choosing, for the moment, to file under not relevant and move on. He pulled the orrery pail's registration records on his wrist display, accessing the public vessel history through Meridian Station's documentation archive, and began to read. The records went back 22 years, which was how long the orrery pail had existed as a registered vessel, and they told a story in the way that records always told stories, not in their content but in their gaps, in the places where information that should exist did not, and in the pattern of transfers and registrations that formed, looked at with a salvager's eye, a clear shape. The ship had changed hands 9 times in 22 years. The first 3 transfers were unremarkable, the ordinary commercial churn of a working transport vessel moving between operators as routes changed and companies restructured. Then a period of 4 years with a single owner, a mid-sized logistics firm based out of a station 3 trade corridors away, during which the orrery pail appeared to have operated normally. Then a transfer that the records described as internal restructuring, followed 6 months later by a sale to a company he did not recognize, followed 14 months after that by another sale, then another. Each transfer slightly less documented than the last, each new owner slightly more difficult to trace, until the most recent registered owner before the auction, a logistics firm whose name he searched and found had been formally dissolved 3 years ago, whose dissolution papers were thorough and detailed, and whose operational history before dissolution was a clean, unobstructed wall of minimum required disclosure and nothing else. Someone had owned this ship carefully. Someone had held it at arm's length through a chain of entities designed to be difficult to follow, and then they had let it go to auction in a way that suggested they wanted it gone rather than sold. He sent this to Gerald with a note that said, "Thoughts." Gerald's response came back in 40 seconds. "The company that dissolved. I looked it up. Its registered directors are a list of names that do not appear anywhere else in any commercial or public record. I checked 4 databases. I want that noted also. These are not real people." Eli looked at that for a moment. "Shell company," he wrote back. "Gerald, yes. A shell that owned a shell that owned a shell that owned a ship with a person in it." Eli. "I need you to not phrase it that way." Gerald, "I understand. She is in a stasis pod. The pod is in the ship. The ship was owned by a series of corporate entities designed to be untraceable. Does that phrasing help?" Eli, "Not significantly." He turned to the non-human transit registry next, which he had legitimate access to through his salvage operator credentials, and which was, every time he used it, a reminder that the universe was larger and more architecturally various than human administrative systems were designed to accommodate. The registry had been built by committee across 31 contributing species over 4 decades, and it showed. The interface had 7 different navigation paradigms, depending on which contributing species logic system the user found most natural, and Eli had never fully committed to any of them, which meant he operated in a permanent state of partial comprehension, understanding enough to function and not enough to be efficient, toggling between paradigms when one failed him, and finding that the next one had a different set of failures. The search function did not operate on identity, because 3 of the contributing species considered specific individual identity to be private information in a way that precluded its use in public registries, and had built their contribution to the system accordingly. Instead, the search function operated on what the interface labeled as observable characteristics, physical description, behavioral patterns, last known context of appearance. Eli had used this system twice before, and both times had found it humbling in a way that formal education had never quite managed. He entered what he had, approximate height, estimated from the pod dimensions. Skin undertone, he paused here, because his scanner had recorded a quality it labeled as chromatically variable in the amber to silver range, which was not a description he had encountered before, and which he entered verbatim, with no confidence that the system would know what to do with it. Hair, dark, low-gravity behavior, possibly autonomous. He stopped, deleted the word autonomous, replaced it with unusual movement characteristics, which felt more defensible. Facial structure. Within human parameters, proportional variations in hand structure. He added the scanner's biological readings in the format the system accepted. The system processed for a long time. Long enough that he refilled his water from the galley tap, which produced a sound that suggested the pipes had opinions about being used, and drank it standing up. The results, when they came, were partial and hedged, and filtered through the registry's philosophical commitments to privacy in ways that made them difficult to interpret directly. There were 3 possible species classifications in the system that shared some characteristics with his input. 2 of them had formal diplomatic recognition and extensive public records, and were clearly based on the scanner data, not a match. The third was listed under a designation that his translation suite rendered, after a pause, as those who do not record themselves, with a notation that the information available under this classification was limited by the classification's own terms, which was the registry's way of noting that this entry had been contributed by a species that considered being findable to be a matter of choice rather than a default condition, and had built their registry contribution to reflect this value. He stared at that for a while. He sent it to Gerald. Gerald's response, those who do not record themselves. I find this either very interesting or very inconvenient, possibly both. I have been considering which. I am still considering. Eli. How long have you been considering? Gerald. 11 minutes. It is a nuanced question. Eli. Let me know when you decide. Gerald. I will note it on your list. He pushed back from the tilted table and walked the length of the galley twice, the way he did when a problem had reached the size where sitting felt like a choice he was making against his own nervous system. He had been on the ship for 4 hours. He had a stasis pod with an occupant he could not identify in a cabin he had barely managed to open, on a vessel with a documented ownership history that appeared specifically designed to resist documentation. And his most useful collaborator in processing all of this was a shipboard AI who communicated in telegrams and had been deliberating for 11 minutes about whether a registry entry was interesting or inconvenient. This was the current state of his resources. He felt it was important to be clear-eyed about this. He went back to the pod because he had to, eventually, and because the scanner data he needed was there rather than in the galley, and because he had been aware, since he left the cabin the first time, of a pull that was not purely professional, and that he was not going to examine closely while he still had active decisions to make. The cabin was the same temperature as before, warm in its specific, sustained way, and the frost on the viewport had continued to clear in the time he'd been gone. He could see her fully now through the glass, the details no longer filtered through condensation but present and specific, and he stood in front of the pod and looked at what the amber light of the cabin made visible, and had the experience of a person who is looking at something carefully, and whose looking keeps failing to settle into the detached register they intended. The iridescence in her skin moved when she breathed, which was slowly, in the long intervals of stasis, but visibly. Her hair drifted in its impossible way, and he had been in enough zero-gravity environments to recognize that what he was seeing was not the behavior of hair in low gravity, but something different, an ambient motion with its own pace and direction that didn't correspond to any air current in the cabin. Her hands were folded across her chest, with the formality of deep suspension, and he looked at them with the scanner's observation noted in his mind, the proportion variations, and registered that the scanner's clinical notation did not fully capture what his eye reported, which was that the hands were correct and also not, in the way that a translation is correct and also not the original, carrying the sense across the gap between languages, but arriving as something new rather than the same thing. His wrist display chimed. Gerald, power cells at 41%. I ran the consumption calculation, Estimated remaining operation at current draw rate is 63 hours. I am putting this on your list as item 1. I am moving everything else down. I hope you do not mind. He looked at 63 hours. He looked at the face behind the glass. Gerald sent a second message. I have decided. It is both interesting and inconvenient. I also want to note that 63 hours is not very many hours, and that I am updating my operational categories to include a new one I have called the stasis situation, and that I consider this a demonstration of initiative on my part in difficult circumstances. Eli wrote back, "It is. Gerald, what are we going to do?" He put the wrist display in his pocket without answering, because the answer required standing in front of the pod for a while longer without the question attached to it. Looking at the slow drift of dark hair, and the quiet geometry of a face that had been suspended in this room through however many years, the orrery pail had been passed between shells that didn't exist. Through 11 ownership transfers and a dissolution and a station auction, and a purchase by a man who had been hoping for condenser units, looking at it with the kind of attention he had stopped pretending was purely professional, and letting 63 hours sit in his mind with its full and specific weight. He made the decision at hour 14, which was not how he would have predicted making it, not as a sudden resolution arrived at through clear reasoning, not as a moral calculation that came out cleanly on one side, but as the quiet acknowledgement of something that had already been decided without his conscious participation, the way a person realizes they have already started walking in a direction before they have formally chosen to go there. The power cells were at 31%. Gerald had sent him 7 updates through the night, each one a single line with the percentage and no editorial comment, which was how Eli knew Gerald was being tactful, because Gerald's natural mode was not silence, and the silence was costing him something. The 8th message said, 29%. And then, after a pause that registered on the timestamp as 4 minutes, I looked up the physiological risks of stasis interruption at low cell capacity for biological systems in the general classification range your scanner returned. I am not going to tell you what I found because I think you will make the right decision without knowing, and I do not want to be accused of emotional manipulation. I will say only that 29% is a number I find uncomfortable. Eli sent back, I'm going in. Gerald, good. I have updated the stasis situation category. There is now a subcategory. I have called it active engagement. I feel this shows continued initiative. The pod's release mechanism was not where he expected it. He had spent an hour the previous evening studying the casing, looking for an interface panel or a manual control, and had found what appeared to be a control surface on the port side, but which his scanner could not fully read, and which he had not touched because touching things on a stasis pod, you don't understand. While someone is inside, it seemed to him like the category of action that produced outcomes you could not walk back. But at 31% and falling, the option of not touching things was expiring, and he approached the control surface with the scanner in one hand and the specific focused calm of a man who has decided that calm is what the situation requires and is therefore producing it by an act of will rather than by feeling it. The control surface responded to his scanner's passive emission before he touched it, which he had not expected. A section of the casing illuminated in a deep blue that was the first color he had seen on the pod since finding it. A soft pulse that moved from the control surface toward the viewport end in a wave, once, twice, as if the pod were acknowledging being looked at. He held very still. The pulse ran a third time and then stopped, and then a sequence of indicators appeared along the control surface in the same unknown script he had seen on the cabin door. And this time his scanner, which had spent 14 hours processing the data it had collected, produced a translation confidence of 40%, which was far below reliable and far above nothing. And he read what it offered with the awareness that he was reading a 40% rendering of something he needed to understand correctly. What it offered was this: sequence initiated, thermal equalization, metabolic resumption, estimated emergence interval 40 to 60 minutes, and then below that, in characters his scanner flagged as a separate notation possibly added at a different time. Occupant health status nominal. Duration of suspension 11 years 4 months variable days. He read the duration twice, 11 years. The orrery pail had been in station storage for an indeterminate period. The auction records suggested at least 3 years, possibly more, which meant she had gone into the pod before the ship was ever decommissioned, before the shell companies had begun their careful work of not existing, before whatever had happened to cause a vessel with a passenger aboard to be passed through 9 layers of corporate fiction, until it ended up in a bottom-tier auction on Meridian Station and was purchased by a man looking for condenser units. 11 years was not a number that permitted comfortable interpretations. 11 years was a person's life, or the piece of a life that she had spent in a sealed cabin on a ship that was being quietly lost, and he stood next to the pod while it ran its thermal equalization cycle, and tried to hold the weight of that number with something more adequate than the expression of a man who has accidentally purchased a complicated problem. Gerald sent a message. The pod is drawing increased power. I assume this is expected. Eli, yes, it's waking her up. Gerald, I see. I have created another subcategory. I have called it the moment. I will not send further messages until it is over. I want it noted that this restraint is also a form of initiative. The 40 minutes passed with the specific texture of waiting that has a real thing at the end of it, each interval longer than the last, the cabin temperature rising incrementally as the pod ran its cycle, and the frost on the viewport, which had nearly cleared over the previous hours, vanished entirely so that there was nothing between his vision and the face on the other side of the glass. And he found himself arranging and rearranging his position in the small cabin, the way a person does when they cannot determine what to do with their hands or their expression, and are aware that both of these will shortly matter. He moved a half step back. He moved a half step forward. He settled on a distance that he decided communicated available but not looming, which was the message he wanted to send, and which he was aware he was thinking about in more detail than was strictly necessary for a practical situation, and which he was thinking about anyway. The seal released with a sound that was less dramatic than he had expected and more physical, a pressure equalization that he felt in his ears before he heard it, followed by a release of vapor that filled the lower half of the cabin briefly and smelled of nothing, of pure and neutral air, the air that had been inside the pod for 11 years and 4 months and variable days, emerging into a room on a salvage vessel, in a station berth in a trade corridor that had presumably not been any part of the plan. The figure inside took a breath. It was audible and it was deep, the breath of a body resuming a process it had not forgotten but had set aside for an incomprehensible interval, and then she sat up. She sat up too quickly, the way people always did coming out of stasis regardless of species or preparation, the body's instinct outrunning the protocol. And she would have continued past vertical into a forward collapse if his hands had not been where they were, which was where he had positioned them after the third rethinking of his position in the cabin, close enough to be useful. And so she came out of 11 years of suspended animation and into the steadying grip of a stranger's hands at a distance of approximately 8 inches, which was not, he reflected in the fraction of a second before everything else, the dignified emergence either of them would probably have chosen. She was fully present in a way the viewport had not prepared him for. The iridescence he had observed through the glass was active now, moving along her jaw and the backs of her hands in patterns that responded to something, temperature, perhaps, or the return of circulation, or something else entirely, that his scanner was already running toward and had not yet reached. Her hair moved with the autonomous, unhurried drift he had been watching for 14 hours, and being in the same room as it rather than observing it through glass was a different experience, not alarming but undeniable, the way certain phenomena are present in a way that photographs do not capture. Her eyes, when they opened, were the color of a sky in the interval before significant weather, and they found him immediately and without the disorientation he had expected, with the direct, assessing quality of someone who had not been confused by emergence but simply interrupted, and who was now continuing a process that had been paused rather than resuming one that had been forgotten. He let go of her arms when it was clear she was stable. She sat on the edge of the pod's interior and looked at him, and he stood in the cabin of the orrery pail and looked back, and the silence had the quality of two people measuring something they had not previously had the instruments to measure. She spoke. The language was unlike anything his translation suite had encountered in 43 written and 31 spoken systems, not close to any of them but not random, structured and deliberate, a question or a statement with the architecture of meaning, and his suite processed it for 4 full seconds and returned. Unclassified phonemic sequence, possible translation confidence below threshold, output withheld. He showed her the scanner display. She looked at it. She looked at him. Something in the geometry of her face moved in a way he would spend considerable time afterward trying to classify and eventually file under probably Rye. She tried again. Different language, different cadence, the same quality of deliberate structure. His scanner processed it for 2 seconds this time and returned a translation confidence of 61%, which was not reliable and was not nothing, and the output read, "You are not the one I expected." He looked at that for a moment. He considered the various responses available to him and discarded most of them and said, "That's fair. I wasn't expecting you either. I was expecting a broken condenser unit." The geometry of her face moved again, more this time, and he was more confident in his reading of it now. It was the beginning of something, the preliminary architecture of an expression that had not fully committed yet but was leaning in a direction. She looked around the cabin, taking it in with the methodical attention of someone completing an inventory, and then she looked back at him and said something shorter, 2 syllables, and his scanner produced. "Where?" He said, "Meridian Station. Trade Corridor 7, Outer Ring." And then, because this seemed insufficient given the circumstances, "Your ship was in storage here. I bought it at auction yesterday. I didn't know you were aboard. That was not in the listing." She processed this. He had the impression that she was translating not just his words but his entire situation, the scanner on his belt and the salvage operator's jacket, and the posture of a man who is trying to convey that he is not a threat while standing in a room that belongs to him, and also, in some prior and more fundamental sense, to her. She said 3 words and his scanner offered 63% confidence. "How long suspension?" He said, 11 years, 4 months. The expression that moved across her face then was one he did not try to classify because it was not the kind of expression that invited analysis. It was the kind that required space, and he gave it that. He moved back to the doorway and stood there, not leaving but not crowding the moment, letting the 11 years and 4 months settle in the cabin's warm air without filling the silence with anything inadequate. His wrist display chimed. "Gerald, I am resuming messages. I have been counting. The active engagement subcategory now has a duration of 53 minutes. I want to ask how it went, but I am aware this may not be the right moment. I am asking anyway. How did it go?" Eli looked at the message. He looked at the woman sitting on the edge of the pod, the one who had been there 11 years before he was there, on a ship that had been carefully lost and then carelessly found, who had looked at him across 8 inches of salvage trade reality and produced something that was beginning. He was fairly certain to be the leading edge of a smile. He typed back, "We are still determining that." Gerald understood. "I have made a note. The note says ongoing. I think this is accurate." It was accurate. He stood in the doorway while she took the measure of a world that had been running without her for 11 years, and he thought about the list on his wrist display, which had been revised so many times in the past 30 hours that it no longer resembled the list he had started with in the galley, which was how he knew he was no longer the same person who had written it. That person had come aboard the orrery pail looking for condenser units, and a return on 11,000 credits and 2 months of docking fees. A practical man with a practical list, and a professionally calibrated pessimism that had served him adequately for 11 years, and that was now, he understood, going to require significant revision. Not abandonment, revision. The pessimism had not been wrong exactly. It had simply been operating on a smaller scale than the situation required. He pulled up the list on his wrist display and looked at it for a moment. Then he added a new item at the top, above everything else, above the condenser units and the station authority and the shell company research and the atmospheric scrubber that still smelled like a stranger's boot, and that he now realized was not going to be the most pressing item on any list he wrote for the foreseeable future. The new item said, "Find out her name." He did not cross it off. It was not the kind of item you crossed off at the beginning to generate momentum. It was the kind you left there at the top, where you could see it, because some items are not tasks to be completed but directions to move in, and the distance between where you are and where they point is the part of the story that hasn't been written yet. She said something in the language his scanner was beginning to learn slowly at 63% confidence and climbing, and this time the translation came back in 3 seconds. "I have questions," he said. "I have some of those too. We can start with yours." She looked at him with the weather sky eyes and the drifting hair and the iridescence moving its slow patterns across her skin, and the thing that had been beginning on her face completed itself. And it was, definitively, a smile, not a human smile. Not mapped onto the specific coordinates his experience had trained him to read, but something that occupied the same functional territory and arrived with the same weight. The expression of a person who has woken up in an impossible situation and has decided, provisionally and against reasonable odds, that the person standing in the doorway might be worth the conversation. Gerald sent one more message. It said, "I have added a final note to the stasis situation category." The note says, "Resolved, ongoing, probably complicated. I believe this covers it. I also want to say that I think we did well considering. I am including myself in that. I feel I was a consistent and supportive presence throughout. Please note that also." Eli put the wrist display away. He looked at her. She looked at him. Outside, Meridian Station continued its ordinary operation, ships arriving and departing on schedules that had nothing to do with any of this. The auction hall cycling to its next lot, Berth 41 holding the Vardy's bell with its broken scrubber, and its 11 months of deferred maintenance, and its air that smelled of no one's boot in particular. 11,000 credits sat in the asset column of a spreadsheet that no longer seemed like the relevant document. The orrery pail held its position in berth 63, old and unloved and present, the ship that had been lost until it wasn't, carrying the weight of 11 years and 4 months in its sealed cabin, and the specific gravity of 2 people at the beginning of something neither of them had planned. He said, "My name is Eli," and waited to see what the 63% confidence gave him back.